Good morning. Welcome to the Oxlep Go Create Grant Application Overview webinar on 3rd of November 2021. I'm James Rule. I'm the Compliance Consultant at Oxlep. So my role is to support all of the Oxlep programs in ensuring that they're compliant with the various different rules and regulations that govern the different funding streams. You've all been joined muted and with cameras off. If you could please stay muted and with the cameras turned off. We have quite a lot of attendees today, so the screen will very quickly get crowded if people turn their cameras on. And to say that this is being recorded, as the voice at the beginning set out very clearly, and the recording will be made available through a link on the Oxlep website as soon as we've downloaded it and got it ready. That should be in the next day or two. If you have any questions, by all means, please ask them. But if you can do that in the chat section, please. Please be aware that you've got a couple of options in the chat. You can ask your question to everyone, so that's the whole audience, but then be aware that everyone in the audience will see it. Or probably better, you can ask the question just to the team, just to the organisers and presenters and panel members. Where we can answer fairly straightforward questions as we go along, one of the team will type an answer in. If there is no answer forthcoming, that means we'll pick the question up during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here's a copy of the agenda. I'm aware that there are some people in the audience who will have seen this presentation previously. There are a couple of changes to it, and I'll flag in the agenda where those will come out. So we're going to do an overview of the Isfp program and eligibility. None of those have changed. An overview of the Isfp grant, so that will have changed. Some of the details there about grant rates in particular and amount of grant funding that is available have changed. How to apply is unchanged. The dates have been updated, pardon the pun, and the rules remain the same. I'll then go into a session on why applications are unsuccessful, to which I've added a new slide this time. So anyone who has heard it before, there will be something additional in there this time round. And then at just after 11 o'clock, we'll move into the Q&A session. And as I've said, please ask the questions via the chat and be aware that there's more than one chat option. Any questions you think of after the webinar, please email to the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address. And please, when asking questions, be aware that we need to share the answers with all potential applicants, so they will be published as Q&As on our website. We would therefore ask that you phrase the questions as generically as possible. Please don't include confidential information, and we will, before we publish the questions, remove anything that we deem to be confidential. So we will make the questions generic and then publish those. So please do check on the Q&As on the website, as we do update those as competitions progress. Next slide, please. So first of all, a very brief introduction to Oxlep. We are the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, so we're responsible for supporting and promoting economic growth and development within the Oxfordshire county, within Oxfordshire. Within Oxlep, the Go Create grants run out of the Oxlep business element, and within that, the Growth Hub. Next slide, please. Thank you. An Oxlep business, through its Growth Hub, provides a range of different elements of business support. These are detailed on the next two slides. I'm aware that the wording is quite small and there's quite a lot of words, but the slides will go onto the website along with the video of the presentation, so you can study these at your leisure. So we provide bespoke business support plan, small business accelerators, mentoring, coaching and one-to-one support. for various different elements of business development. We do a 6-week Foundations to Growth program. Next slide. Thank you. We offer a non-exec director for a day, which is 8 to 10 hours of very focused support. We provide webinars, power hours, surgeries, Go Create grants, which are match-funded grants up to 50,000, subject to this presentation. We offer peer network support, startup boot camp for people who can start businesses, and we're running a marketplace event on the 18th of November. So if you haven't signed up for the Oxlep Business Marketplace event, please have a look on our website and sign up to that. So as I say, there is a range of business support available through Oxlep Business, of which the Go Create grants is one element. Next slide. So within Oxlep Business, the Go Create grants sit under the Innovation Support for Businesses program. This has 3 elements to it. One was the renovation, refurbishment of some different facilities, so some space, some capital spend. That was the Eco Business Centre up at Bicester and the Agile and Prototyping Labs at the university. We also provide innovation support products, so that's the one-to-one support and webinars, one-to-many support that were mentioned on the previous slides. And we also provide the Go Create grants, which is the subject of this presentation. The programme is led by Oxlep as the lead delivery partner, and we did have some partners, though their role came to an end late in 2020. That was the University of Oxford, the City Council, Cherwell District Council, and Oxford University Hospitals Trust. Next slide. I suppose I should also have said on that last slide that the programme is part funded by the European Regional Development Fund, hence the logo in the bottom right of the corner, bottom right corner of the slides. I suppose the elephant in the room with all of this is, are there any changes brought about as a result of the UK's departure from the European Union? The short answer is none, nothing changes. The programmes remain part of the European Structural and Investment Fund programme until they close down, and they continue to be governed by the EU regulations and the UK Managing Authority's guidance based on those. Managing Authority now being, I think they renamed as the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So we're responsible to that department for delivering the programme in line with the EU regulations. Next slide. So eligibility. Eligibility is for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. So that is a business that has more than 250 employees, is not more than 25% owned by a business that is not itself an SME. So if you have one SME that owns 50% of another SME, provided the combined size of the two businesses together still meets the SME criteria, then both of those two businesses remain eligible. This is a fairly complicated area, so there are some things that do not count. Venture capital companies don't count, nor do university ownership stakes in spin-outs. So there's a degree or a range of exemptions to the ownership. If in doubt, contact the team on the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email, and we'll help you through that if you're not sure. And then the slightly more simple criteria, you have to have a turnover of less than 50 million euros and or a balance sheet of less than 43 million euros. That will be based on your last published accounts. Next slide. Thank you. You also cannot be what's known as an undertaking in difficulty. This does not include any business that is less than 3 years old. And it is I'm sure some people will have heard me talk about this. It is a line in the sand, a fairly inflexible line in the sand, that's written into the regulations to ensure that only viable businesses receive support from the programs. So an undertaking that is a business is an undertaking in difficulty if more than half of its subscribed share capital, or its capital for an unlimited liability company, has disappeared as a result of accumulated losses. Okay, that's the one that caused people most problems, and I've got another slide on that in a moment. Similarly, if a business is subject to insolvency proceedings, it will be an undertaking in difficulty. That's a fairly simple test. Similarly, if you've received rescue or restructuring aid, you're an undertaking in difficulty. If you have received rescue or restructuring aid, you will certainly know that you've received it. Because we deal with SMEs, I have yet to come across a business that has received rescue or restructuring aid. And it's worth noting that this does not include any COVID-related grants or business support. It's based on the age and financial position of the business as at the last published accounts. And the test for the first two bullet points, the share capital versus accumulated losses, is a very simple calculation based on the balance sheet, effectively, of the accounts submitted to Companies House. When you signed up to the Isfp program, you will have completed a declaration that confirmed you are not an undertaking in difficulty. But it is worth noting that we're formally obliged to check for anyone applying for more than £50,000 worth of aid. So that could be a large Go Create grant plus some workshop support, in which case we'd have to formally check. Otherwise, we are required to do random spot checks. As I've said before, and will say again during the presentation, if in doubt, if you're not sure about the undertaking difficulty test, please contact the team and we will happily walk you through that process. Next slide. Thank you. So the next slide sets out a couple of different scenarios for the undertaking difficulty test. So if we assume a business has £10,000 worth of capital, has no accumulated losses, so it's broke even or it's made a profit over the course of its lifetime, then it passes the undertaking difficulty test, not a problem at all. If the business has £10,000 worth of capital, has cumulative losses of £4,999, it passes the test. However, if the business has made those cumulative losses of £5,001, it will fail the undertaking difficulty test because 50.01% of its subscribed capital, its capital, has been lost through cumulative losses. So as I say, it is a very black and white and inflexible test. And then slightly more clearly, if you have capital of 10,000, losses that exceed your capital, clearly you fail the undertaking difficulty test. There are instances, we come across it more frequently with social enterprise type businesses, where businesses are set up without any underlying share capital. In that case, effectively, if you've lost even £1 over the lifetime of the business, if your cumulative losses are £1 or more, you will fail the undertaking business test because 50% of zero capital is zero. So you can't have any cumulative losses. This is a clear failing of the undertaking difficulty test. It's why I don't like it very much. Unfortunately, there's nothing we or the managing authority can do about that. If in doubt, please speak to your accountant. And the fairly simple formula that I've written at the bottom of the slide is that the capital plus your cumulative profit and loss account should be greater than or equal to capital divided by 2, so half of the original capital. As I say, it's fairly complicated. If in doubt, please ask us and we'll do our best to walk you through it. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So what are the other key eligibility issues? This is mainly around delivery of the grant and costs that can be included. We cannot include any staff costs. So anything that goes through your PAYE scheme, anyone who's on payroll, anyone you pay national insurance contributions for, cannot be included in the costs for a Go Create grant. That's not to say that individual subcontractors, you can bring in a contractor to deliver against a Go Create grant, but you need to make sure that they do not fall under PAYE, that they're not staff, and it's best to run the HMRC's IR35 checker across the consultancy, across the contractor, to ensure that the appointment doesn't fall foul of IR35 and therefore should be on payroll, because at that point it becomes ineligible. And we'd have to remove all of the costs relating to it. VAT costs, you can only include VAT in your claim if you are not registered for VAT, or if for some other reason you cannot recover the VAT from HMRC. Now in brackets there it says seek advice. We are not tax advisors, we're certainly not VAT experts. Please speak to your accountant and your tax advisor for advice on this. It is a complicated area, but effectively the purpose of this line is to ensure that VAT costs are only covered once. If we repay a VAT cost to a company as part of their claim, and the company then recovers that again from HMRC, then that cost has been paid out twice to the company, and that's not allowed. Key eligibility issues that we also come up against are the procurement audit trail. Go Create grants are public funding, so they are governed by the requirements of public procurement. We do accept that none of the SMEs that we've ever worked with fall under the qualification of a public contracting authority, but there is a requirement for a procurement for spending public funding and an audit trail that supports that. So for anything that is less than £25,000, we do require 3 written quotes, and I do say some more about this later in the presentation. For anything above £24,999, so 25,000 and above, there has to be an open procurement. Now that includes an advert placed on Contracts Finder, which we can help with, a formal specification, formal deadlines, scoring of responses, formal notifications of outcomes, that sort of thing. If you think you're going to go through the open procurement process, please talk that through with the team. It's critical that the process is robust and that you get it right first time, because it is very difficult to retrospectively fix issues with an open procurement process. The other issue that we often come up against is a desire to continue, understandably, using suppliers who are already involved in the applicant business. Now, there is nothing to say that you cannot use a supplier who is already involved in your business. In fact, there are often very good reasons to do so. But reference the 2 bullet points above about written quotes and open procurement. You have to be able to demonstrate that public funding is being spent to the best value provider. That does not mean the cheapest supplier. It means the supplier that provides the best value to the business. And you need to be able to justify that. Over and above, we always use them, which is not an acceptable justification. We occasionally come up against issues around defrayal. So defrayal is very specifically the money leaving your business bank account. At that point, it becomes an eligible cost and can be included in claims from us. The 2 areas we often have a bit of confusion around are credit cards and overseas bank accounts. When you pay for something on a credit card, you as a business have not paid for it. The bank has paid for it from the credit card. It is only the point at which you pay off the credit card that you as a business have defrayed the money. That's not to say you can't use credit cards, but there is an additional step in the audit trail process. So normally there is an invoice and there is a redacted bank statement that shows you paying that invoice. Simple. With a credit card, you have the invoice, you then have a copy of the credit card bill, and you then have the bank statement that shows the credit card being paid off with at least the same amount as the invoice that you're claiming. So you're not required to pay off the entire card, but you are required to have paid off the amount that you're putting through as part of your Go Create grant. People also have overseas bank accounts. So if you have an overseas supplier who charges in, I don't know, US dollars, and you have an overseas bank account that has a dollar balance, it is perfectly acceptable to save yourself some transaction charges and pay the supplier from that bank account. The issue that you have there is that if you paid from a UK account, a sterling bank account, and made a dollar payment, the bank account, yes, would include some fees, but it would also include a very clear statement of the exchange rate that had been applied at the point the money changed from sterling to dollars. With an overseas bank account, there is no equivalent exchange rate relating to the date of the transaction because the money was already in dollars. You need to be very clear which exchange rate you're using, preferably the European Central Bank's reference rate for that day. And you need to explain to us where that rate came from. Essentially, we need to be able to take a calculator and reverse engineer the sterling amount that is going through your claim to reach the dollar amount that is being defrayed. Again, if in doubt, please contact the team and we can run through this with you. Next slide, please. Thanks. So Isfp Go Create grants at the moment can include revenue and capital costs. So we're coming on to some elements that have changed from this round. There's some ERDF definitions of revenue and capital. An individual item, so a thing, laptop, fridge, very expensive shelving, that costs less than £4,999, excluding VAT, is considered to be a revenue cost. Okay, so if you're buying some equipment and no single piece of equipment costs more than £5,000 or 5,000 or more, then it will all be revenue costs. However, within that, if you have an individual item that costs more than £1,000 but less than the 4,999 threshold, it's what's deemed to be a mobile asset. So we will still have to record that mobile asset on the Isfp program project's asset register. And that is to ensure that there's a record of the individual assets that have been purchased through ERDF programs and that they are used for the purposes for which they were bought. Okay, so there's details that we need, asset numbers, serial numbers, a photograph of the asset in situ, please. We frequently have lovely photographs of new 3D printers, for example, which are taken so closely that 3D printers would actually be sitting in someone's living room and we'd never know. I have had conversations with auditors who do not accept that because in their opinion, the 3D printer was supposed to have been based in a manufacturing facility somewhere, and they can't tell from the photograph whether the 3D printer is sitting in the director's living room or in the manufacturing facility. So they did make the director go and take some wider angle shots. Again, we'll help you through that process. And therefore, any individual item that costs £5,000 or more, all of these are excluding VAT, I should say, is deemed to be a capital item. So it becomes a capital cost within the program. The information we need to add to the asset register is exactly the same as for a mobile asset, but the categorization within the budget that you put into your application will be different. Next slide, please. Thank you. So within that, there are various things that we cannot fund. Salary costs, so things that go through PAYE, I have already talked about. That's in there twice, at least partly because of the IR35 changes that came in earlier this year, start of the financial year. Please make sure that you do use the HMRC checker to ensure that any contractors or consultants that you're using really are consultancy costs and shouldn't be treated as salaried staff. We cannot fund travel and expenses. As I've mentioned, we cannot fund VAT payments that you can recover from HMRC because you can't recover VAT twice. We cannot cover debt or refinancing costs. So we can't cover any interest elements. So as it says below, no hire purchase. If you take out a hire purchase, that includes a loan repayment element, which has an interest cost to it. So that is not eligible. Nor can we cover what I call statutory or legislative requirements. So what that means is that if you have an innovation that you're developing, which by law has to meet a certain standard, we cannot cover the costs of achieving that standard. If, however, you have an innovation that has met its statutory requirement, but that would be more marketable if it had a higher certification, that is something that we can support and we can help with because it's optional. It is not a statutory requirement. We can't include training costs. Now, that doesn't include leadership and management development, so things like mentoring. But anything that results in a qualification is not something that we can cover under ERDF. The reason for that is that sits within the European Social Fund rather than the Regional Development Fund. I've talked about hire purchase. We cannot cover vehicle purchases. Please don't go out and buy a car or a minibus or any other kind of vehicle. Next slide. Thank you. We really can't cover vehicle purchases. This is deliberately in the presentation twice. And the reason for that is that when auditors come to Oxfordshire, this is actually something that they check for. There was an old ERDF project that was reaching the end of one of its financial years, realized it had an underspend against its budget, and decided that the best way to achieve their spend target for the year was to go out and buy a car, which they did. We still have the same auditor who comes out and does some of the audit visits on our current programs. So he does still check for vehicle purchases as an ineligible cost that he's seen before in Oxfordshire. We can't cover anything that is a like-for-like or routine replacement of equipment. So if you have a machine that makes widgets, if you need a new one, but it's the same machine, it produces the same widgets in the same amount of times, the same quality, it's a like-for-like, it's a routine replacement. It's not eligible because there is no additional benefit to the business. Nor can we cover preventative or remedial maintenance. So if your widget machine needs servicing because it's going to break down in 6 months, that's not something that we can cover. We can't help you to build or refurbish retail facilities. And there are some very specific sectors that we cannot support. So we can't support the primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries or aquaculture, so no fish farms, no farms. There used to be a very helpful list of things that qualified as primary production. Unfortunately, since the UK's departure from the European Union, that website has been archived, so it's no longer available. We have found a replacement reference within one of the EU regulations. So if you're worried that you fall into the category of primary production, please let us know and we can direct you to the relevant guidance. We can't support the road freight sector, nor can we support what are called services of general economic interest. I used to do a show of hands when I did this live, face-to-face, to see who actually knew what those were. It's things like Oxlep, it's things like economic development agencies, it's schools, public schooling, it's the National Health Service, it's that sort of general services of general economic interest. They can certainly be your customers, but they cannot receive a Go Create grant from us. We can't support export related activities. It's always a slightly odd one. You absolutely can export the innovations that you develop. What this means is that we cannot fund a project that was specifically setting up the infrastructure to carry out exports. It's just a strange element of the program that is ineligible. Nor can we fund activities which favour domestic over imported goods. Essentially, there can't be any discrimination. So if your project said, and we will only consider procuring suppliers who are based in Oxfordshire, for example, it would not be eligible. Okay, it needs to be an open project. There cannot be any discrimination within the projects that we fund. Next slide, please. As you can probably imagine, there remain a series of deliverables upon which we report. We need to report how much grant we've paid to the grant recipients. Well, that's fairly straightforward. We know that because we've paid it. We need to report how much match those grant recipients have put against the grant that we paid. Again, fairly straightforward because we'll have your claims, so we already have that data. We need to report new businesses supported, so that's businesses less than 12 months old that we've supported. Again, we will know that from your sign-up form, so that's not an issue. We'll need to report employment increase, so this is new jobs created as a result of the support that we've given you. Now, this takes the form of a self-declaration, supported if necessary by things like job descriptions. There is an issue to note with this one, certainly in a post-COVID environment, and for businesses that have been working with us since pre-COVID times. The declaration for this is, I'm paraphrasing, but effectively, when we started working with Isfp, we had X number of employees. Now that we've finished working with Isfp, we have Y number of employees. That is an increase, that's the assumption that's in there, of Z jobs, and these are thanks to the project support. The issue that we face nowadays is that the company that started working with Isfp or Go Create pre-pandemic may well have found that at that stage they had 20 employees. Before they got the Go Create grant, they had 12. And as a result of the Go Create grant, they've been able to increase from 12 to 15 employees. The problem that we have there is that the point at which you engaged with us, you had 20. The point at which you finished your engagement, you have 15. Therefore, you've actually lost 5 employees. I have had this debate with the managing authority, and I get a response that says, yes, they understand the issue, but because of the way the regulations are written, there's nothing they can do to change them. Please be aware that when you're promising us new jobs, do have a think about the point at which you signed up to Isfp, and therefore what the reference number of jobs may be compared to when you finish your project. This comes back to something that I always say on this slide, which is to make sure that your commitments are realistic. If you promise us 20 new jobs, 10 new products to the firm and the market, and 16 new collaborations with a research institution, chances of receiving a grant, simply because the assessors and Oxlep will find that rather hard to believe. there would need to be an awful lot of justification within a grant of the size that we're giving to achieve all of those things within a reportable timescale. Please think about the new jobs that you promise us, the number of new products to the firm and that you will have launched to the market that you tell us you'll achieve, and the new collaborations with research institutions that you'll achieve. I'll just dwell on the collaborations with research institutions for a moment, because this is something that's becoming a priority program. This is new, so it shouldn't have been existing prior to the ERDF support. It needs to be an ongoing collaboration, and you need some kind of agreement with a research institution that sets out what both parties will bring to it. Now, that's not to say that we will necessarily be in a position to come back and check how long your collaborations have lasted, but the intention needs to be that the collaboration is ongoing. And a research institution isn't just a university, it's anything that would qualify as a research organization. So anything that has research as part of its articles of association or its charter would be in scope with this. Nor does it have to be a UK-based research institution. It can be a research collaboration with an institution anywhere in the world. For all of these things, evidence is needed, and as you can imagine, a compliance person saying there's a form for these. So there is a way that we capture it, and we will track the impacts that you've achieved compared to the commitments that you make in your grant application. Next slide, please. So I will tell you what this is supposed to say, and we will update with the final version from my laptop on the website. So the budget for the Go Create grant pot overall, both capital and revenue, is around about £1 million, a fraction over. So the original Go Create revenue grant pot was 875,000, but we've had some underspend from the capital side of the program that we've been able to wrap into the grant pot. We are not explicitly delineating capital and revenue elements because we still have a degree of flexibility within the budgets. But overall, we have around about 28% of the £1 million grant pot, so something in the region of 280,000 of uncommitted grant funding. The maximum grant we anticipate will still be at £50,000, but the grant rate, which is actually the most critical part of the presentation, is now at 40%. Okay, so previously Isfp grants were running at 25% grant and 75% match. They are now running at 40% grant and 60% match. We've been able to do that because we've been able to redeploy elements of underspend from elsewhere in the program. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. Capital and revenue costs. So we talk about R&D type activities, investment in product and service development, research, both technological and applied, developing pilot lines, which can include both early product validation actions and first production, so it's early stage production elements. What we cannot cover are you setting up production lines for the sort of full run. There's got to be a development of the innovation within the Go Create grant activity somewhere. So the next slide, I'm fairly sure, has my big picture with lots of, some people will remember this, lots of different innovation related words and activities within it that is designed to convey the breadth of innovation and the scope by which we define innovation. So we take a very broad approach to innovation within the Isfp program to ensure that both product and service development is included. Effectively, we want to be as broad a church as we can be for innovation. We don't want to be excluding innovation. but elements that are lower on the innovation scale, so sort of iterative innovations, are less likely to be funded. It's much more difficult to justify funding very minor iterative steps in an innovation, especially for something that's already in the market. But that is not to say that your innovation has to be completely new, completely novel, and not in the market at all. Can we move on now? Slides. So what I've said that the grant rate is changing to, sorry, James is grinning, to 40%. So I'm going to suggest that you have a look at these slides when they are the correct version when we upload them to the website. So how does it work? You have a grant offer with a total eligible spend of £100,000. We would have a maximum grant offered of 40,000, which is 40% of the total eligible spend rather than 25%. In an ideal world, you spend your 100,000, you then put the 100,000 into claims to us and we reimburse 40,000. So that's fairly straightforward. We do all understand that the world doesn't work like that. So what usually happens is that there is a slight degree of over or underspend. So if the eligible spend is £80,000, so you've underspent on the project, the maximum grant that we can pay is £32,000, which is 40% of the total that you have spent. So 80,000 times 40% is 32,000. If, however, you overspend, so say your total eligible spend against an approved total project of 100,000 was 120,000, then the maximum grant that we can pay out is capped at the £40,000. So that's the maximum grant offered. So we can pay the lowest of the grant rate against your total costs or the maximum grant that we have offered. Now we've set that out in the grant offer letter in a fair amount of detail, and it's something that we'll cover in a kick-off meeting with all successful grant recipients, where we walk you through the process for how the grants work. Next slide, please. So how to apply? Excuse me. Read the guidance on the website. So the website includes a copy, or will include a copy of the correct slides. It will include a copy or a link to a version of this presentation. It includes Q&As that we update as new and different questions come in. We've been compiling these since the beginning of the Isfp program a couple of years ago, so they're quite comprehensive now. And we also have the grant guidance, which tells you about the process. It tells you more detail about the different eligibility elements that I've run through, and gives you guidance on completing the application form. You should also speak to the team. Fill out the application form using the checklist provided. It's a really helpful checklist. I know, I wrote it, that allows you to tick off all the different elements that you need to complete, and the different bits of supporting information that we need, such as business plans, last filed accounts, that sort of thing. And then wait and see. Following submission, we will review and assess applications and run a grant panel to make funding recommendations in line with the timetable even that we've published. Now I think the timetable is on the next slide. If we could go to that one, please. Thank you. So the next cut-off date for Go Create grants is midday on the 19th of November this year. We expect to be able to notify people on or by the 10th of December. Okay, so it takes us about 3 weeks to run through the process. I do caveat that by saying that if there are a significant number of grant applications, then it's entirely possible that the process will slip. If it's going to slip, all of the applicants will be noticed. We'll tell you what's changed, and we'll tell you the date by which we now expect to be able to notify you. The cut-off date is usually the midday on the third Friday of each month. That's not the case for December. The cut-off date for December is the 15th, which, if my calendar serves, is the second Friday in December. Again, it's at midday. And the notification is about a month later, so that's the 14th of January 2022. The reason for that is fairly straightforward. Christmas and New Year fall there, and Oxlep's offices formally close for around about a week over Christmas, so we do need to build that in and manage people's expectations. Within January, we go back to the midday on the third Friday closure date, so that's the 21st, with a notification by the 11th of February. Should those dates change, they will be highlighted on the Go Create pages of the Oxlep website. Whether there are any further cut-off dates for grant applications beyond that is entirely down to whether or not we have any remaining budget, or whether we've committed the whole of the 280-odd thousand that's available. And just to note that we're not able to offer the soft check proofreading service that we've done in previous rounds. So people who've seen previous versions, certainly pre-COVID versions of the Go Create Grant webinar, please be aware that we're not able to offer that service that we've done before. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the specific rules on funding: we can only reimburse defrayed expenditure incurred after the date of the grant offer letter. Okay, so when you apply for a grant, do not start spending money until you know from us that it will be eligible to be claimed. Okay, so if you spend all of your money before we give you a grant offer letter, then the grant offer letter's eligible expenditure date is going to mean that that spend is not eligible. If you think you need to spend anything before the offer letter date, you must absolutely contact us. There can be reasons for that, and there can be ways to work around it, but the grant offer letter is the contractual document for the grant. If the offer letter gives an earliest date for expenditure to be incurred, you cannot claim anything incurred before that date. Talked a bit about procurement rules. 3 quotes are required. We do need to see those with the application. We do, however, understand that suppliers are not always as prompt as you might wish when you're seeking 3 quotes from the applications for your application. If a quote has to follow later, please tell us that. Please explain it within the application. And if the grant panel recommends your project for funding, it will be a condition of the funding that the 3 quotes or the missing quotes are provided. If you think you need to follow an open procurement process, then say that within the application. Okay, we don't require you to follow an open process before you apply to us, because you don't even know if we're going to award a grant. Therefore, it's a waste of time and effort. But tell us that you know you need to follow an open process, and you will have had this discussion with the team already. Evidence is critical for everything. Evidence of activity, evidence of expenditure, in order for us to be able to reimburse. And I do ask whether we're flexible or rigid. And the answer that I usually give is that we are as flexible as we can be within a very rigid framework of rules and regulations. Next slide, please. So the next couple of slides give some examples of Isfp clients which have been supported. So for example, EcoSync, which was a technology engine environment type client. So that was a low-cost hardware logger for temperature and occupancy monitoring. Educake, which was an education technology product for online homework and revision. Lightricity, which was a prototype miniaturized PV harvester and autonomous miniaturized sensor system for Internet of Things. And Oxwash, which was a software package supporting the scale up of their existing business model. So that was an emissions-free laundry. Next slide. Next slide is a very detailed case study for the Creation Theatre. I don't intend to read through this, but it will be in the pack, so you can have a look at the sort of things that Creation Theatre has done. The web address at the bottom, next slide please, will take you to the various different GoCreate grant case studies that we've got. So have a look at those, have a look at the sort of things that people have done with awarded contracts and the impact that a GoCreate grant has had on them. I think that's quite helpful in thinking about the sort of applications and the grant project that you're looking to put forward to us. Next slide. Okay, so now moving on, slightly late, apologies for that, to the why are applications unsuccessful part of my presentation. Now, a lot of these slides people may well have heard before, but there is one new one in there. So first thing is length. So think Goldilocks. So what I mean by that is that your application should be neither too short nor too long. It should be just right. So what I mean by that is that we give an anticipated length or a maximum length for answers to the 2 questions in the GoCreate application. That is not a target, nor is it a benchmark to be exceeded. If you can tell us everything that you think we need to know for your application in less space, that's fine. Please do that. There are no bonus points for filling out all of the space that we've said is allowable. Having said that, if you've written your GoCreate application and your answers to the 2 questions are barely a paragraph in length each, you've almost certainly written too little. There will not be enough in the application for the assessors to be able to fairly assess the application and to make funding decisions. Next point is, please don't be obtuse. So what do I mean by that? I mean, please keep it simple and clear and try and avoid using long, complicated words like obtuse. Quite often, people forget that they are the experts in their field and that we are not. So the assessors for the applications, certainly when you get to very technical applications for innovations, are unlikely to have the same level of expertise as the people who are developing those innovations on a day-to-day basis. Please try and avoid going too far into the technical, very complicated detail around your innovation. I have seen applications that have included a couple of pages that were effective chemical formulas and explanations for chemical reactions. That's a bit too detailed. You need to keep it clear, you need to keep it simple for the assessors to be able to read it and understand it. It's very difficult for assessors if they are lost in the detail. Applications can be unsuccessful due to style. Now, that is not to say that an application will ever be turned down for spelling mistakes or grammatical errors. We don't do that. We're not marking homework. This is not how an application assessment process works. But everything within your application does influence the assessors. And if they read an application that is littered with spelling mistakes or grammatical mistakes, it does make them worry about the quality of the application and the attention to detail put into the application. Certainly applications written in Word have the spell check and the editor function, so please use them. The other issue, if the spelling and grammatical errors are particularly bad, is that assessors are in a position where they cannot understand the application that's in front of them. If they can't understand the application because they can't understand what the words on the page are actually saying to them, it is very difficult to be able to award high marks when assessing that application. So very, excuse me, very much linked to that are considerations of quality. Please take your time when drafting an application. If you're starting today with the deadline on the 19th, then realistically you have enough time to produce a good Go Create application. If you're starting on the 17th or the 18th, aiming to submit on the 19th, you do not have time. Okay, there's not going to be enough time to get an application written to a quality that is likely to be successful. Within the application, applications can be successful because they are inconsistent, so please be consistent. If you're applying for a grant of £15,000 on the first page, please make sure that the grant figure is also £15,000 on the second and third page, and in the various tables that the grant figure appears throughout the application. It is very difficult for assessors to know what it is they are scoring if that changes on a page-by-page basis. So if the amount of grant and the total project costs vary throughout the application, it becomes very difficult for an assessor to know whether they're assessing a grant with total costs of 100,000 or a grant with total costs of 50,000. So one thing that we would suggest is to have it proofread. Again, if you've left enough time, you can find somebody to proofread it. It's always a good idea, if possible, to have it proofread by somebody outside of the immediate circle of people who've been drafting it, preferably somebody who is unfamiliar with your grant application and your grant project. Applications can be unsuccessful because they are reviewed and proofread effectively within an echo chamber. Something that we all hear about at the moment with social media. Effectively, in this context, if you are proofreading an application and you already know that application almost inside out, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to bring an independent eye to the application. So find somebody who can proofread it independently. And the last thing is to complete everything. If a box is blank, can you actually put not applicable in and it still makes sense? So there are some boxes where this does make sense. You know, you can put not applicable in certain boxes. Have I, you know, what other sources of funding have I sought? None, not applicable. Application still makes sense. What grant rate am I requesting? That box needs something in it. Put not applicable in there, then it doesn't make sense because you need a grant rate. So please do think that and check that all of the boxes that are in there have got something in, or that you could put not applicable in and the application still makes sense. The thing to remember is that although we put a lot of boxes into the application forms, they are all there for a reason. We don't put boxes in for no reason at all. So do think whether you're sure that that box does not apply to you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the content of the applications, people sometimes assume a degree of prior knowledge. Now, I've said that assessors are unlikely to be experts in your technology, your innovation. The reason for that is fairly simple. It is your innovation. You will be the expert in that area. So please don't assume a degree of prior knowledge amongst the assessors. So what that means is, if you find yourself thinking, well, it goes without saying that, pause for a moment and remember that it never does. If you don't put in the thing that is obvious to you because you live with this innovation on a day-to-day basis, then chances are that at least one of the assessors will read the application and not have that prior knowledge. They won't know that. They won't know the thing that is obvious to people very familiar with the innovation. People get very excited when writing applications. They want to dive straight in to the grant project itself. It's entirely understandable. I've done it myself when writing applications. You want to dive in to what you're actually going to do, what you're going to spend the money on, because that's the critical thing for you. And it absolutely is, but when you're writing an application, assessors are coming to it cold, effectively. So you need to start at the beginning. Who are we? What do we do? Where does this innovation fit with who we are and what we do? Go on to the middle, which is the part about the innovation project. So what are we actually going to do with the grant money if we're successful? And then finish at the end, and that is what is the impact that the grant is going to have on us. So if you follow that step-by-step journey when you're writing your grant applications, you can be sure that you will have given us relevant content. So that's the next point, the things that we need to know as assessors in order to score the applications. If a grant project is not set within that context, either the background to the business, so why should this business be looking at this innovation, or with the impacts that it's going to achieve, it's very difficult for assessors to award high scores. If we don't know what the impact will be on the business and the economy, we can't give high scores for that. Within this, you need to think about the relevance of the content. Does what you're putting into the application actually advance the understanding of the assessor who's reading it? You are in effect telling us a story. I hate this phrase, but I have not been able to think of a better one over all the years I've been doing these presentations. What you're doing is telling us a story. You're telling us what it is that we need to know in order, firstly, to understand your business and your grant project, and also then to be able to assess it and to award scores to it against the criteria that we've published in the guidance notes. Now, linked to all of this is the use of attachments and additional documents. I've mentioned before that there are some things that we absolutely ask for: business plan, previous accounts, evidence of match funding, that sort of thing. So those are requirements. Beyond that, we have left it open for whether applicants provide additional documents and attachments in support of their application. Applications can sometimes fail because they rely too heavily on attachments and additional documents. So what I mean by that is that if you write an application that relies entirely on an assessor having also read a 180-page attachment, it is very unlikely that the assessor will be able to do that in time they have available, and it is therefore very unlikely that your application will be successful. Please use attachments and additional documents sparingly. So if you need to attach a 40-page document to your application, it is quite important to direct people to the relevant page or pages of that document. And that doesn't mean see pages 10 to 30 of the 40-page document. It means see pages 10 or 10 to 11. Okay, direct them to a very specific part, and the assessor is much more likely to be able to look and digest the relevant part of your attachments. Next slide. So there are some process elements as well. There's RTQ, which is read the question. The example I always give here is of an old history teacher of mine who used to tell the possibly apocryphal story of how she was in her final exams at university, and she wrote the best ever essay that she'd ever written in her life on 18th century France. She got to the end of the exam. She looked back at the questions, as you do if you have a couple of minutes left, and then realized that she should have written it on 17th century France. Take the time to read and understand the question. And the next one, no real prizes for guessing this one, answer the question. If you've read and understood it, so you know what it is we're asking you for, please make sure that you then provide that within the answer that you give. So that goes back to things like relevance of content, telling us a story, and also getting somebody to proofread it. Somebody should proofread it alongside the questions and the guidance that we give. 3 quotes really does mean 3 quotes. I am very reluctantly forced to admit that there are certain circumstances in which it's not possible to get 3 quotes. The most obvious one being if you want to pay for Facebook advertising, because that's the most appropriate for your innovation. The only people who really quote for that are Facebook. So you will, if you're doing it directly, only have 1 quote. That will be from Facebook. That's fair enough. There's a very easy single tender justification for that. We're using Facebook to advertise because they're the most appropriate platform. Nobody else is Facebook. That's fairly simple. In an ideal world, and I must admit I have yet to see this anywhere, if it really is impossible for other companies to quote for a small piece of equipment or a consultancy service, whatever it may be, then ideally what you would have is confirmation from other companies that you've approached that says they can't do it. And in my absolutely idealized compliance world, it would also say, we're terribly sorry, we can't do this. The only company we know of that could do it is ABC, and ABC is the company that you have a quote from. I admit that I've never seen that. But you do need to bear in mind that when we say 3 quotes, these are the sort of tests that we'll look to apply to them. Is it really impossible for nobody else to deliver that? Next slide, please. So this is my new slide on why applications are unsuccessful. And it's mainly thinking about assessors. Now, I don't mean applications are unsuccessful because assessors are mean and nasty. Generally speaking, we're not. We are looking for ways to award scores. Our requirement is to score applications based on the content provided. So that's the content of the application form, the content of the business plan, which we've explicitly asked for, and where we can realistically look at it, the content of the additional information that you may or may not have provided. If it's not in the application form, if it's not clear, we cannot award points for those elements of your application. If you haven't told us what the impact of your innovation will be on either your business or on the Oxfordshire economy or on the wider economy, for example, there's no way we can award the points for the impact on the business and the wider economy because we don't know what it is. We can't guess. Okay, so that's the 3rd bullet point on there. The content has to enable assessors to award scores. If it's not there, if we can't see it, if we can't find it, or if it's not clear, we can't guess, and assessors are not expected to make assumptions. They are there to challenge, so they challenge assumptions, and they will have external expertise in sectors, certainly in innovation. But they will challenge the content of applications. So a reason that applications are unsuccessful is that they don't address those challenges. When you make an assumption within your application, you need to justify it. You need to explain why that assumption is there. The most common one that assessors come across tends to be an assumption that you will have a growth rate of a couple of 1000% in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, etc. Just because that's the growth rate that you've told us. If you're going to tell us a certain growth rate, you do need to validate that, explain the thinking behind the assumptions, because the assessors are chosen to challenge those sort of assumptions. If there's a rationale that is sensible, understandable, and explained, the scores will be higher. If there is a bland statement that it will have a massive impact because our customers will grow at a couple of 1000% a year for the foreseeable future, it's not going to score very highly because we can't justify that. So as well as making recommendations for funding, through a panel session, having scored applications, things to remember about assessors is that they are invariably time poor. Now, this is true across virtually every grant-funded program that you will apply to. It's true across virtually every procurement exercise that you may respond to. Assessors will never have as much time as they may want in order to devote to individual assessments. That then links back to a lot of the things I've said about the relevance of the content, making it easy for the assessors to read and follow. Sorry, I just need to plug the laptop in. Would really crown the presentation off if the presenter gets cut off with his laptop running out of battery. Assessors never have the time that they would like to devote to assessments. So please make it as easy as possible for them. If your application is too long, talked about that already, it's going to be difficult for an assessor to run through it and spend the time thinking about the right scores for it. Something to bear in mind. Next slide, please. So last couple of comments before we go to the Q&A session. When you have a grant, please wait until the grant has been awarded before you spend it. That reflects back to my comment about dates from which you can incur expenditure costs. Please do actually spend it. If you think you're going to underspend or not spend the grant, please contact us as quickly as possible. The earlier we know, the earlier we can help you, or the earlier we can redeploy the grant into the grant pot. Please then make sure you claim it once you've spent it. It does always slightly surprise me that some grant recipients have to be chased quite hard in order to submit a claim to recover the money that they've paid out. And as I've said, if there are delays or if anything changes or you have any problems, then please tell us. We are here to help and to make the grant process as pain-free as possible. I think the critical thing to remember is that within this process, it is always better to ask for permission rather than for forgiveness. So what I mean by that is that if you realize something needs to change and you just do it and you spend £10,000 on the different changed project, if you haven't agreed that with us in advance, there is no guarantee that it will be eligible, that it will be acceptable, that it will be something we can reimburse. Please tell us first. And then the last thing, of course, is to provide the necessary evidence with your claim. This is described in the guidance notes, and we do run through it in the grant kickoff meetings. If the evidence is missing, if there's no proof that the money's been paid out of your bank account, or an invoice is missing, all that will happen is that we will send the grant claim back to you and request the missing information. We cannot process and pay a grant claim with evidence missing. It has to pass audit before it can be paid. Next slide, please. So for more information, you can watch this again. Link will appear on the website shortly. The slides, the correct slides, and the guidance notes will appear on the Oxlep website. And the Q&As are up there as well, and they will be updated every time we receive new questions that are not already in there, or that are not effectively already answered within there. And if you have any questions that you're not raising today or that come to you later, please email them to the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address. Next slide. There we go. I think I'm now going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to compare or umpire the Q&A session.
Hello, good morning everybody, and thank you James for your presentation. That was really helpful. My name's Tracy James and I'm the Programme Executive on Isfp and I support across the Growth Hub. Peter, who's joined us, would you like to introduce yourself, Peter?
Hi everybody, I'm Peter. I've met some of you, I know, I recognise some names. I'm the Innovation Advisor for the Innovation Support for Business programme, which means I work on a one-to-one basis with clients, but also organise some of the webinars, which some of you may have attended in the past. And just to, by way of context and what I can do with regard to your potential applications, James mentioned that we don't have a rigorous sort of pre-check service at the moment, but we are able to give some advice to people looking to put an application in to help shape the project. And maybe I can look at the strengths and weaknesses of your application because I'm not involved in the assessment or the panel process and the scoring. So that's my role with regard to the grants.
Thanks, Peter. So we have a few questions, which I will read out and then defer to the correct person. So we have, let's have a look. So the first one's on planning. So the guidance documents refer to planning process. Is there something specific that you require for that? Can I throw that to you, James? Is there something specific we're expecting?
So you broke up a little bit there at my end. So is that a business planning or planning permissions?
Yeah, saying the guidance document makes repeated reference to planning process. So is there something specific we're looking for?
I don't think so, he says. Now, why am I saying that? We certainly make reference to need for business plans, and that needs to be provided alongside your application in whatever format you have it. So clearly a business that is starting up will have a less detailed business plan than a business that's been around for 3 or 4 years. I don't think we make reference to planning in the sense of planning permissions, because we're not expecting that to be an element of the Go Create grant. But if we make a note of this one, then I'll have a look at the guidance notes and check whether the answer we've just given is comprehensive, unless Peter has anything to add.
No, sorry, because I've seen that question before. That's from somebody I know has got some experience with the scheme, and I'm not sure, without going into the guidance, which I'll put my hand up, I haven't done for a little while. I think we need to take a look and try and think what that refers to.
Okay, then we will do that and publish that in the Q&As on the website.
Yeah, I think eligible revenue project examples like investment in product and service development, developing pilot lines. I think that's what he was alluding to.
Okay.
But like so, we can publish that in the Q&As. Okay, let's look at the next question. So can we use this grant in conjunction with a similar grant from another organisation?
I'll try and answer that to give you a rest if you want, James.
Please do.
If you're pursuing an innovation activity, then probably you're going to use a range of different funding sources to get your product from concept to market. We recognise that. So within the overall sort of world of activities that you'll be doing to get your product or service to market, there'll be a whole load of activities which will not necessarily be reflected in your application to us for some funding, and you can use whatever funding you can to get that product out there. What you can't do, unfortunately, is match one grant source with another grant source to make up your total eligible project cost as far as the Go Create grant is concerned. So, for example, you're very unlikely to be able to use something like an Innovate UK Smart grant to make up the 60% of costs which you've got to show us you can afford to defray. So yes, you can use grant funding from wherever to get your product to market, and we don't necessarily need to know about that. But unfortunately, when it comes to match funding the total eligible cost and your proportion of those costs, it's unlikely that there are many grant sources which we would be able to accept. It's because in most cases that would mean your funding, your overall funding is more than the intervention rate which these grant schemes support. And it's an unfortunate thing, but we are looking for, I think James might have referred to clean money, which doesn't mean money that hasn't come from drug dealing or something. It means money that has not been used in another grant matching process.
Thank you, Peter. And the next question, so he's asked if they could use grant to help pay for CE or UK CA marketing test houses, because without this, they would not be able to sell their innovation.
Again, I'll have a go at that, James, if you want, and you can chip in. I think James mentioned that you can't use innovation funding generally for statutory costs, meaning, you know, if your business needs a certain approval or trademarking or CE marking, sorry, or something like that to be able to operate, that's a statutory cost. I mean, say for example, in the medical world, you know, there's lots of approvals and things that you need before you can operate. What you can do, however, is persuade the panel that some expertise and advice is needed in order for you to be in a position to be able to apply for and achieve those statutory sorts of obligations and qualifications and criteria, such as I've mentioned CE marking a couple of times. Now, if you separate out the cost of the expertise against the cost of standard, you know, qualification fees and assessments, then probably we can look at those costs. The parallel that might help you understand this, we can apply, you can apply to us for advice for intellectual property. So that means the advice of a patent agent or lawyer or some other sort of professional with regard to intellectual property. What we can't include in eligible costs is the actual cost of the registration with the IPO. So if you in your scenario that you're talking about, if you're able to separate out the two different types of costs and advice that you're receiving, then we may be able to help.
Thanks, Peter. Next question. Would renting a location be eligible as part of the grant?
Renting a location, unlikely, but remotely feasible. I can think of an argument where you say you need to rent a premises to conduct some experiments or do some prototyping or something like that. And you only need that space for the duration of the project, and then you're going to give it back and you won't be using it subsequently. If you're trying to include rent in the same way as a normal business overhead, then it's not really innovation activity in the terms that we think about it. So I think it's unlikely, but I could think of us at a stretch of where it might work. James, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree, and that's I had the same stretch you did, Peter. I think what I would say is that if it's a business as usual cost, then it's unlikely to be eligible or approved as part of a Go Create grant application. But as Peter says, if it is a specifically innovation related cost, then there is a case to be made for it. What an assessor, the grant panel, would think of that case is, I don't know. It would vary on a case-by-case basis, pardon the pun. And it would be for you as a grant applicant to demonstrate how strong the case for that cost is.
Thank you. I think this is the last question now. When does funded projects start and finish in relation to the grant allocation?
So if I've understood the question correctly, you can't start your project until you've been given an award letter by Oxlep. Now, at the beginning, I explained that your project is probably lasting for years in that sense, but as far as the project for which you are applying some funding, so that set of work packages or elements for which you want some funding from Oxlep, you can't start that until we've given you the go-ahead, or the panel's given you the go-ahead, and that's reflected in something called an offer letter. As far as the duration of the project is concerned, it's kind of up to you, but the innovation support for business is coming to an end. So, you know, there is going to be a general sort of 3-month to 6-month project timescale, which I think Tracy can sort of confirm that we'll be looking for. Anything over that is a little bit harder for us to approve, because, to be honest, most projects go on longer than they're supposed to, and so we need a bit of a cushion at the end of the program. I think that's what that question was alluding to, and I think the important thing is don't start until certainly don't start spending money and incurring costs, because anything before the grant offer date would be ineligible.
Thank you, Peter. So that's the end of the questions that we've got on the chat bar. Is there any closing comments from you, Peter or James?
I think probably two comments. The first that I tend to always make is good luck with your applications to the programme. And the second comment is that I know that I've set out, and the correct version of the slides will set out the remaining grant pots along with 3 deadlines. Please don't everyone assume that we will allocate all of that money on the first deadline. I think that is extremely unlikely. In fact, if that happens, I will, I'm not entirely sure what I'll do, but I will leave it initially. My advice then, following that thought through, is submit your application when it is ready to be submitted. Don't rush it to get it through for the 19th of November. You are far more likely to be successful with a strong application submitted in December than with a rushed application submitted in November.
Thank you, James.
Just to build on that, I would recommend that people don't leave it too long to obtain quotations and that side of it, because it's quite often that side of it which will hold up your application. If all that stuff isn't in place, then the application will be rejected. So you know, start early to get the quotes and things like that lined up, even if frankly you're pretty sure you know who you want to work with and where you want the work to go. So within limits, I can give feedback on people's ideas, and my colleagues can also give a bit more feedback on things like the rules and making sure all the boxes are ticked. But don't leave that till the day before either. So you know, give us a bit of notice if you can, if you want some support. Yeah, good luck with those activities. The final thing I would say is that James alluded to, briefly spoke about some case studies, and if you really want to know what other people have used this money for, then I'd have a look at those things first, you know, before ringing us up or contacting me and saying, could I do this, can I do that? Because, you know, there's some really interesting examples of how people have made this work for them.
Thanks, Peter. I'd just like to say thank you to Peter and James for their support today, and thank you to everybody for attending. I hope you found the presentation helpful. We will send an email to all of you today with Peter's contact details, the PowerPoint presentation, and various other information to you. And like Peter and James said, contact us. We're here to help and support, and good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.